You're running for president as a Democrat. What to you are the strongest values that represent the left wing politics uh, of this country?
I would say protection of the environment and the commons, the air, the water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands, those assets that cannot be reduced to private property ownership,
Hmm.
the landscapes, our Purple Mountain Majesty, the protection of the most vulnerable people in our society, people which would include children and minorities, the restoration of the middle class, and protection of labor, dignity, and decent pay for labor, um, uh, bodily autonomy, a woman's right to choose, or an individual's right to endure unwanted medical procedures, peace. The Democrats have always been anti-war. The refusal to use fear as a governing tool.
Hmm.
FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because he recognized that tyrants and dictators could use fear to disable critical thinking and overwhelm the desire for personal liberty. Um, the, uh, the freedom of government from untoward influence by corrupt corporate power. The end of this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is now, I think, dominating our democracy. It's what Eisenhower warned about when he warned against the emergence of the military-industrial complex. And then I prefer to talk about kind of the positive vision of what we should be doing in our country and globally, which is, I see that the corporations are commoditizing us, are poisoning our children, are um, strip mining the wealth from our middle class, and treating America as if it were a business in liquidation, converting assets to cash as quickly as possible, and creating or exacerbating this this huge disparity in wealth in our country, which is eliminating the middle class and creating, kind of a Latin American style feudal model where there's these huge aggregations of wealth above and widespread spread poverty below. And that's a configuration that is too unstable to support democracy sustainably, and we're supposed to be modeling democracy, but we're losing it. Um, and I think ought to have a foreign policy that restores our moral authority around the world, restores America as the embodiment of moral authority, in which it was when my uncle was president, and as a purveyor of peace rather than, warlike nation. My uncle said he didn't want people in Africa and Latin America and Asia to think of, when they think of America, to picture a man with a gun and a bayonet. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. And he refused to send combat veterans abroad, combat soldiers abroad. He never sent a single soldier to his death abroad, into combat. He sent 16,000. He resisted in Berlin in 62. He resisted in Laos in 61. He resisted in Vietnam. Vietnam, they wanted him to put 250,000 troops. He only put 16,000 advisors, which was fewer troops. And he sent to get James Meredith into the university, to Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. One black man. He sent 16,000, and a month before he died, he'd ordered them all home. He actually, I think it was October 2nd of 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had died, and he asked his aide for a list of combat fatalities. And the aide came back, and there was 75 men had died in Vietnam at that point. And he said, "That's too many. We're going to have no more." And he signed a national security order, 263. and ordered all of those men, all Americans, home from Vietnam by 1965, with the first 1,000 coming home by December 63. And then in November, he, of course, just before that evacuation began, he was killed. And a week later, President Johnson remanded that order. And then a year after that, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, we sent 250,000, which is what they wanted my uncle to do, which he refused. And it became an American war. And then Nixon, topped it off at 560,000. 56,000 Americans never came home, including my cousin, George Skakel, who died at the Tet Offensive. And we killed 1 million Vietnamese, and we got nothing for it.
So America should be the symbol of peace.
Today, my uncle, really focused on putting America on the side of the poor.
Yeah.
Instead of our tradition of fortifying oligarchies that were anti-communism. That was our major criteria. If you said you were against communists, and of course the people were the rich people. Mm-hmm. Our aid was going to the rich people in those countries, and they were going to the military juntas. Our weapons were going to the juntas to fight against the poor. And my uncle said, no, America should be on the side of the poor. And so he launched the Alliance for Progress and the USAID, which were intended to bring aid to the poorest people in those and build middle classes and take ourselves away. In fact, his favorite trip, his two favorite trips while he was president, his most favorite trip was to Ireland. Just incredible emotional homecoming for all of the people of Ireland. But his second favorite trip was when he went to Colombia. He went to Latin America, but Colombia was his favorite country. And I think there were 2 million people came into Bogota to see him, this vast crowd, and they were just delirious cheering for him. And the president of Colombia, Yeras Camargo, said to him, do you know why they love you? And my uncle said, why? And he said, because they think you've put America on the side of the poor against the oligarchs. And, when my uncle, after he died, today, there are more avenues and boulevards and hospitals and schools named after, and statues named after and commemorating, and parks commemorating John Kennedy in Africa and Latin America than any other president in the United States, and probably more than all the other presidents combined. And it's because, he put America on the side of the poor, and that's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be projecting economic power abroad. The Chinese have essentially stolen his playbook. And, we've spent $8 trillion on the Iraq war and its aftermath, the wars in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And what do we get for that? We got nothing for that money, $8 trillion. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. Iraq today is much worse off than it was when Saddam was there. It's an incoherent, violent war between Shia and Sunni death squads. We pushed Iraq into the embrace of Iran, which now become essentially a proxy for Iran, which is exactly the outcome that we were trying to prevent for the past, 20 or 30 years. We created ISIS. We sent 2 million refugees into Europe, destabilizing all of the nations in Europe for generations. And we're now seeing these riots in France, and that's a direct result from the Syrian war that we created and our creation of ISIS. Brexit is another, result of that. So we, for $8 trillion, we wrecked the world. And during that same period that we spent $8.1 trillion, bombing bridges, ports, schools, hospitals, etc. The Chinese spent $8.1 trillion building schools, ports, hospitals, bridges, and universities. And now, the Chinese are out competing us everywhere in the world. Everybody wants to deal with the Chinese because they come in, they build nice things for you, and there's no strings attached, and they're pleasant to deal with. And as a result of that, Brazil is switching to the Chinese currency. Argentina is switching. Saudi Arabia, our greatest partner, that we put trillions of dollars into protecting our oil pipelines there, and now they're saying, we don't care what the United States think. That's what Mohammed bin Salman said. He said we don't. He dropped oil production in Saudi Arabia in the middle of a U.S. Inflation spiral. They've never done that to us before, to aggravate the inflation spiral. And 2 weeks later, and then they signed a deal, a unilateral peace deal with Iran, which has been the enemy that we've been telling them to be a bulwark against for 20 years. And 2 weeks after that, he said, we don't care what the United States thinks anymore. So that's what we got for spending all those trillions of dollars there. We got short-term friends. And the United States, policy abroad, and we have not made ourselves safer. We've put Americans in more jeopardy all over the world. You have to wait in lines to get through the airport. You have to, the security state is now costing us $1.3 trillion. And America is unsafer and poorer than it's ever been. So, we're not getting, we should be doing what President Kennedy said we ought to do, and what China, the policy that China has now adopted.